Welcome back to the Forging Radical Hope podcast from the American Journal of Public Health 2024 Student Think Tank. Quick reminder, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers. They do not necessarily reflect the American Public Health Association, American Journal of Public Health, or the American Journal of Public Health Student Think Tank. Today, we're bringing you part one of a two-part episode to align with the American Journal of Public Health August issue, which focuses on indoor air quality. Today's co-host is Mateo Frumholz, an AJPH 2024 Student Think Tank member who received his BS and MPH from the University of Minnesota and is currently getting his PhD in environmental health, also at the University of Minnesota. He comes to us with a lot of knowledge of environmental justice and environmental racism activism around the Twin Cities area. And he also comes to us with 5 years experience working at the Minnesota Department of Health as an epidemiologist in the refugee health program.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam. I feel like the Twin Cities is often goes unnoticed in the broader EJ movement, but it's such an incredible city, and lots of really great work, lots of really great organizers doing a lot of really innovative stuff in the EJ world. So really happy to be here and chat all about it.
That gives you a good sneak peek at the breadth of the episode today, which includes history, community intervention, and a zine reading by Mateo himself. Up first, a conversation with Elaine, LaFay, and Paul Sampson, authors of the article Ventilation and Public Health, A Fraught History.
My name is Elaine, LaFay. I'm a historian of climate and the body. I'm an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, and I'm currently working on a new history of climate debility and settler colonialism in the 19th century U.S. South.
Yeah, and I'm Paul Sampson. I'm assistant professor of history at University of Scranton. I'm a historian of science and medicine, and my current project is entitled Ventilating the Empire, British Science and the Origins of Climate Control. So it's sort of a long history of ventilation through the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciated your article, Ventilation and Public Health, A Fraught History. And for our listeners who might not have read it yet, would you give us a short summary and teaser?
Sure, I can take this one. So this essay, it sort of started with current proposals to improve air quality in schools, and we tried to offer a historical perspective through which to view those proposals. So a lot of contemporary public health improvements are pitched as these voluntary, incentivized options or programs for businesses or schools to improve their productivity and often profits as well. And so what we tried to do is compare these pitches, which a lot of them are coming, some of them are coming before the COVID pandemic, some of them are coming afterwards. So there's sort of a moderation or an increase in these proposals after the COVID pandemic and during, obviously. But what we tried to do is show how historically this sort of voluntary incentivized approach tends to leave the primary causes of air pollution untouched. So while we clearly support things like, the Biden administration's Clean Air and Buildings Challenge, we also wanted to note how these types of programs often have failed to achieve real results. So that's kind of the general thrust of our article.
Cool. And we were really curious at the think tank what inspired you to write this piece.
Oh, sure. So it came out of a conference roundtable that Paul and I had organized a couple years ago for the History of Science Society annual meeting. And one of the things that we were both really struck by, that our work is quite complementary in this regard. Paul works on the history of ventilating machines in the British Atlantic in the 18th century. I look at 19th century ventilation on slave plantations in the antebellum U.S. South. And we were both struck first by kind of the long history of inequality in the history of ventilation. That ventilation is quite political. And we were also, there were really interesting similarities between our work. For example, we both look at populations who were quite limited in the resources that they had available to them, prisoners and enslaved people, but who each sought to manage ventilation on their own terms and in really similar ways. So one of the things that Paul has shown us is that 18th century British prisons, prisoners would actually break ventilating machines because they were cold. In the 19th century, enslaved people would manage the cracks in the logs between their cabins. They would manage ventilation by plugging up the holes, in spite of enslavers claiming that ventilation improved their productivity. And so both of these it's really similar method. And it both sort of showed that, neither population really cared what the state wanted or about profit or productivity. They wanted to be warm and they wanted to be comfortable. And so out of this conversation, we started to think really critically about the kind of long history of ventilation and, how we could contextualize contemporary concerns in this kind of long arc. And so that's where the piece came from. And the kind of specific example, I think even when we were talking in the conference, we both looked at each other like, whoa, you too. It was interesting in that way.
I'm curious, from your point of view, what's something you want people steeped more in the public health science or policy space to kind of take away from this historical lens of this issue?
I mean, to that point, there is a lot of continuity. I think this is one of the things that we show. There's a lot of continuity in approaches to ventilation, and assumptions about ventilation and why it's important, why it's worth pursuing. What I want people to take away is that this was not inevitable. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't predetermined. Instead, it was the product of a very specific historical moment in the 19th century, the product of a very specific set of concerns, where you have people like Edwin Chadwick, who are trumpeting ventilation and public health more broadly as an engineering problem. That was quite controversial at the time. There were other folks, even then, as there are now, saying that no, ventilation is something that is connected to a broad swath of what we would today call social and economic determinants of health. It is not something that can be pursued in isolation. That's something that, I would want people to know even about those continuities. There's nothing inevitable about, for example, this unregulated approach to ventilation that was done very deliberately at the moment. But it doesn't have to stay that way, right?
Yeah, I'll kind of follow up on what Elaine says and just say that there's an article that I return to pretty often by the historian Christopher Hamlin called "The Necessaries of Life," and he makes the argument in that article that certain aspects of what we're seeing as necessary for human health, like drinking water and lighting, and to some extent ventilation, became kind of public concerns in the Victorian era. And other aspects of what we're seeing as necessary to human health, like medical care and food, were kind of left up to the free market. And he makes the argument, and I agree with him, that those are a set of choices and decisions, and some of them are kind of arbitrary. And the way that you pursue those aspects of public health is also this set of very deliberate choices and decisions. As Elaine says, none of this is kind of natural and received from on high. I mean, these are all choices about what we should pursue in public health and the extent to which we should pursue them. And I mean, the other thing I would add on is that I think, there's a lot of timidity in policymakers these days about like, how do you manage kind of freedom versus regulation, and how bold can you be with certain projects? And I would say that the history of public health shows that if your public health program actually solves a problem, and I'm thinking about, the retrofitting of the London sewers in the 1860s and 70s, which was a massive project. It involved building 1,000 miles of sewer lines and these enormous embankments all up and down the Thames, but it solved the problem of London sewage and drinking water, and it is popular. It's controversial as it's happening, But then if it actually ends up making a substantial difference and making people substantially healthier and safer, I think it can be effective. So I think finding one thing that history can teach us maybe is finding a little bit of courage about approaching public health issues and about taking a kind of more proactive approach. So.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing all these insights. I have one more question. So with the think tank this year, we are working with the theme Radical Hope through Community and Creativity. And so we like to ask our guests, what is something giving you hope right now, either in this realm of public health, air quality, or anything else? Yeah.
Well, I love the theme. I think that finding hope is important every year, and so I think I really applaud the theme. It's also a really good question. You know, what gives you hope about public health in 2024 when we've got a lot of things to worry about? But I was chatting with Elaine about this, and you know, one thing I would say is I think there's a lot of really great kind of ecologically minded movies coming out this year. Movies have been good. I don't know if you've seen Dune Part 2, but or Dune Part 1 maybe. But that's a movie that is, Frank Herbert, who wrote the novels. I'm just going to nerd out for a second. Frank Herbert, who wrote the novels, was inspired to write them while on kind of an ecological field trip to the Oregon dunes on the Oregon coast, and he was just thinking about surviving in this environment. And that's a film that, the entire plot is basically about people trying to survive in a really challenging environment and the sorts of culture, how that affects culture and how that affects a lot of their choices and decisions. So, that's something that's given me hope, is that something like that can be successful at the box office that really encourages people to think and imagine those sorts of questions.
Sort of relatedly, I've been interested to see and excited to see how those same themes are being taken up in scholarship, especially new scholarship, especially by scholar activists around heat, both in history and today. So people like Nick Shapiro and Bharat Venkat, who are both at UCLA, they both have really exciting labs that are thinking really broadly around heat inequality. Kara Schlichting here in New York City, where I live, has been doing a lot of research on the history of heat waves, which is ever more important. I'm actually coming to you from a heat wave right now. And so I've been thinking a lot about her research on the built environment. And so these things, there's a lot more work to be done, but I think these scholars are among a really big community of scholar activists, especially around issues of heat and ventilation, that has given me a lot of hope lately. So thank you. I agree. Thank you for the question.
All right, next up, we'll have a conversation with Jennifer Ahumada, who got a bachelor's in health promotion and is working on a master's in applied biostatistics and epidemiology. She's been working in environmental justice research lab for 3 years and is going to talk to us a bit about some of the community workshops she's been doing. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. So I think with the timing of you just getting your bachelor's, I think I would love to hear how you got into public health and what that's been like to start studying it during the past few years.
Yeah, so when I was applying to colleges in high school, I had applied to become a health promotion major, which is the name of our public health program at USC. And I didn't know what public health was because this was shortly before the pandemic. But I just knew that I wanted to be involved in health in some way, and I liked kind of the interdisciplinary nature of the program. And I applied for the program, and quickly in my senior year, the pandemic started, and I began to learn a little bit about public health. And once I started that fall in college, I was introduced to environmental health. And I applied for this program known as the EH Matters Fellowship and started working at the Environmental Justice Research Lab.
Cool. Yeah, I think that is a bit of a common thread when we've talked to people, to current public health students, that people didn't really necessarily know that they were already doing, something that fell into public health, and then they found some of the language and the research and stuff for it. So I always love hearing that, right? That people following this passion or this interest for a specific community or specific issue in their community. And what I wish were more common, I think, in some of these programs would be some of the opportunities you've taken to engage with communities and do workshops. I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
So we developed the indoor air pollution workshop. And the first part of it was kind of like a lecture where we introduce what indoor air pollution is, what the sources are, kind of protective actions a person can take. And one of the protective actions is using air purifiers. But we want our workshops to be solution focused and solutions that work for community members. So air purifiers sometimes tend to be pretty pricey. So that's where we were trying to figure out how we can kind of integrate a hands-on aspect to the workshop that would work for the community members. And we've came across the DIY air filters and like different guides online. But a lot of those guides were pretty technical and kind of hard to follow. So we created our own guide that was had easier words to understand and it was a little bit easier to follow. And we integrated that into our workshop. And this way, when like we do these workshops, we also want community members to leave the workshops feeling like they're empowered to kind of and have the resources to take care of their health and protect their health. So this was a way to make the workshop hands-on and engaging and also kind of give that confidence to people that they can do stuff like right now that can protect their health.
Very cool. So if I'm correct me, is the name, it's like a Rosenthal box? Right?
Yes.
Okay.
So with four filters. So the DIY air filter, you put 4 filters. These are MER filters that you use for AC. So you could go to Walmart, you could go to any Home Depot, any of those stores, and just regular AC filters and a box fan, and you just tape the 4 air filters together, and you put the box fan on top, and you're able to create this filter that there has been studies that show that work pretty closely as like HEPA filters. So they're pretty efficient and they also tend to be less expensive.
Cool. And you were mentioning that some of the guides that are out there about the Rosenthal boxes and the DIY air quality improvement can be technical. They're not necessarily written for the audience, for the communities you're working with. So I'm curious, what are some of the modifications you made and what do you prioritize when you're editing some of the stuff that's already out there?
Yeah. One thing is language is really important, making sure that it's easy to understand and also like the explanation of how it works. Because when we were going through these guides, that was the most complicated way. Like they would use a lot of fancy words trying to explain how this works. So we created graphics that show like the dirty air blows in and we have that like different colors here and it comes out clean this way and explaining like breaking down like what these filters are doing and how like what's the difference between like the different filters that you might go to Home Depot, might go to Walmart and see. So breaking down this information in a way that like visually and in a way that it's easy to understand.
You know, I think a lot of people in public health might not assume that people want to know why this filter works or how, but I guess, what are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, well, especially with the DIY filters, they could be quite large. So if you're going to have this large thing in your home, you want to know like, what is it doing? Is it going to actually work? Like you don't think putting pieces of tape together on these objects that seem random are going to create something useful. So it's really important to like show how this works so that people can understand that. And beyond just making it the language of it and like accessible, it's also kind of making the information accessible. So like posting something on social media where it might only reach kind of people who are already in the field isn't as effective as going out into the community, working with community groups that already have that audience and sharing that information to make sure it actually reaches community members.
On that note, do you have any messages for anyone else studying public health right now based on some of the things that you've learned so far?
One thing is like I recently had my graduation for my undergraduate degree, and in the commencement ceremony, when they confer the degree, they say that it's given to us with all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities. And that word responsibility, when it was said, like it really stuck in my mind, and every day it's kind of stuck in my mind because we were given the privilege of having this knowledge and skills, and we're given the right to practice public health. but we also have the responsibility every day to make decisions that promote and protects health, and to make the health for the public better in a just way.
Before we go, the question that we like to ask our guests for the series is, what is something giving you hope right now?
Seeing how involved the youth are in public health, environmental justice, climate change, how knowledgeable they already are and engaged, gives me hope for the next generation, because they're going to be advocates to better the health for everybody.
We hope you found those discussions as fun and engaging as we did. And now we'd like to close with something a little different. We have Mateo Frumholz reading the fold-out zine by artist WormyOrchids, aka Jam Dowdy. And then Mateo and I having a little reflection on the role of art in public health.
The zine is titled Why I'm Still Masking in 2024. And the cover is a beautiful portrait of a neighborhood city street in a metropolitan area. There's someone sitting on the rooftop in the top left corner on one of the buildings, looking out at what seems to be either plumes of smoke or clouds. The story begins with a kid laying in bed with all their stuffed animals sleeping. Quote, "I hate getting COVID. I've already caught it twice. Isolating is not a fun experience, and neither is the disease itself. Besides, the more infections you rack up, the higher your chances are of experiencing long COVID." Unquote. On the next page, another kid is seemingly taking public transportation on their way to school. Some folks are masked and others aren't. One person is coughing in the background, and there's a cross-section of either a coronavirus or a rotavirus or some other virus on the bottom of the page. Quote, "I hate getting sick. COVID is far from the only thing going around. I don't want the flu or RSV either." Unquote. The story continues to a picture of some kids doing arts and crafts with plenty of crayons and paper and leaves all over a table. Quote, "I work with kids and families. Kids get enough exposure at school and are bad at keeping germs to themselves, even in the best of circumstances." Unquote. The next scene is a party where you can only see the faces of those who are masked. They are pointing at each other and seem to be dancing together and enjoying each other's company. Quote, "Solidarity with other maskers. It really sucks to be the only person masking at a crowded event. I want other COVID cautious people to feel seen, validated, and appreciated." Unquote. A narrow scene on the next page shows a group of people, some masked, hanging out at a coffee shop or bar. They all seem to be indoors and sitting close to each other. Quote, "I do not know everyone's status, whether it's vaccination, exposure, chronic disease, or other risk factors. I cannot read people's minds. I also think we shouldn't pressure immunocompromised people to constantly explain their needs to us. Masking without being asked makes places more accessible to people, period." Unquote. Now the story continues with a side-by-side image of a character wearing a hat and glasses and a mask. You can't really make out much of their face, but you can see them come up in the security footage of the store they are in. Quote, "Surveillance software sucks. Facial recognition software has built-in racial bias. All companies are breaking likeness rules left and right, and doxing is more popular than ever. So I might as well keep my face to myself in public." Unquote. Now the following page is all text and reads as follows. Quote, "This zine is about my personal bodily choices, not guilting other people about theirs. In 2020, I was fixated on policing other people's choices. It was exhausting. I now understand that I do not know everyone's life stories and reasons. I also am not perfect at masking, so please take this as a snapshot of my own motivations as we all hopefully continue to do our best to care for one another. Jam Dottie at WormyOrchids." Unquote. The last page is a beautiful network of portraits. that almost looks like a city grid in and of itself, a symphony of roundabouts, if you will, highlighting the inherent connection between all of us. The text on the right-hand side reads as follows, quote, "Masking is the most low-effort, high-impact thing I can do to keep my loved ones and yours safe. Partners, family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, service workers, strangers. Our government and healthcare systems aren't protecting any of these people. This isn't how it should be. The burden of keeping our entire community safe is too much for each person to carry. But that's the way it is right now. To get a different and better future, we've got to keep taking care of each other. With love, Jam."
Thanks so much for reading that zine and describing it aloud for us. I'm curious what some of your takeaways were as you were reading the zine.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a great zine that I feel like brought up so many different points related to masking that are either directly or even indirectly related to like personal like health safety. Like I think, we'll talk about it a bit later, but I think one of the really fascinating topics brought up was this idea of like living in a hyper surveillance world and system, and how masking can even kind of help counteract those effects as well. But I think one of the things that really stood out to me was this idea of just constant like personal responsibility that is thrust upon all of us trying to live in a society, in a collective world. And I can't help but think how today's narrative of not only choosing to mask or not, but also choosing to test or not, choosing to like self quarantine or isolate if you've been exposed or are infected. All of that has almost always been in the realm of personal responsibility. Even during the thick of COVID, I feel like a lot of it was just maybe a few months of, we're all in this together. But then after that, it was like, well, you do what you need to do. Here are some general guidelines. So that is something that I think was really a good reminder that it's really challenging to to address public health concerns in an individual capacity. So I think there's incredible power in potentially adding zines to a staple, a canon in public health communication, and also potentially a way of again, right, who the audience is, right? I think we make a lot of policy language to, like during COVID, we were sending all this information to businesses about how to protect customers and stuff like that. And I just can't stop thinking about how cool it would have been if we published zines about how to mask, how does masking look like, why is masking important, how does it actually protect people. So yeah, I think that would be really, really cool to do. And yeah, I think Jam did an incredible job with that zine.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's my takeaway for this part of the episode, that there should be artists in residence at public health departments. I think that'd be a great expansion of communication efforts. And I'll steal this zine as like my closing thought on seeing creative projects come out of these issues of public health is something that really gives me hope, because I think it shows that people care, right? I think that and the fact that, right, this person made zines that are at this event and has people like interacting with it online, like I think shows that people care and that there is a base for improving population and community health and health equity, that people do care about it. And we need different ways of connecting with people and coming together to really act on that care. That was part 1 of our episode on indoor air quality. Stay tuned for part 2, where we will talk with an environmental justice content creator, a PhD student doing air quality research, and learn more about Mateo's experience working in the Minnesota Department of Public Health. Until then, you can stay up to date with the AJPH Student Think Tank on LinkedIn. We post updates and publish a newsletter there, and we'd love to continue the conversation.